Dear listeners, before we start this episode, Nikhil and I would like to make a special request. We've both been watching the impact of the devastating earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, and our hearts go out to those who are suffering. Could we please request you to open your hearts and contribute something to your trusted charity or aid organization that is involved in the relief effort? It would make our efforts here so much more meaningful. Thank you for your generosity, and we now turn to our podcast episode, which is on a topic that we think you'll find especially relevant to opening our hearts in ways more than one.
Hello, you're listening to Chai Across Generations, a podcast to understand and maybe even bridge the gap between generations of South Asians. This is Nikhil.
And this is Shankar. We all know that there are lots of topics that are hard to discuss or off the table between generations.
We want to change that. We could be so much stronger if we open up the dialogue and better understand one another.
So, Nikhil and I, as friends a generation apart, will discuss a different topic in each episode over a cup of chai to explore just how much we all have in common and better understand our differences.
We believe many of these topics will resonate beyond the South Asian community, and we welcome listeners of all backgrounds.
We recognize that others in our generation may have different perspectives, and we hope this will spark interesting discussions.
So let's dive in. On today's episode, we're going to chat about Valentine's Day, since it's right around the corner. Shankar, how do you feel about Valentine's Day?
Oh, Nikhil, that's a complicated question. So maybe I'll start with some background. To be honest, I don't think I had heard of Valentine's Day until I came to the US. And maybe I can give you a little bit of context about that. So when we were growing up in India, we didn't have the kind of instant access to things around the world as you do now. So if I remember, one of my distant uncles used to send us a subscription of Time and Newsweek, the two magazines. And apart from that, the Indian newspapers, they did cover some international news, but by and large, it was focused on domestic issues, right? Domestic politics. And so if you can imagine, our window into American culture or culture across the world, not just American culture, was very limited. So I remember my mother used to take us to a place called the British Council Library, which was sort of our outlet to reading magazines from around the world and stuff like that. Some people used to listen to the BBC, a fewer to Voice of America and things like that. But our exposure to culture in the US is dramatically lower than what you have access to world culture today. So that's something to keep in mind. I don't think I had ever heard of Valentine's Day till I came to the US, quite honestly. Maybe in a book or something, but it was nothing that was a big presence in our lives at all. And so from our generation's perspective, when I came to the US, I actually had a deep distrust of all Hallmark marketing gimmicks. Maybe it's growing up and going to graduate school, in a pretty liberal environment. We had a lot of skepticism of capitalist and consumerist exploitation, particularly because we were as poor as church mice as grad students. So it made sense that we would not be very pro-capitalist or consumerist, right? I don't think I could have afforded a dozen roses and a fancy dinner, even if I wanted to take someone out. And I started digging into it a little bit, actually, since you mentioned we're going to talk about this. And I looked around on Google, of course. Now we can get all our information on that. And the history of Valentine's Day is peculiar and troubling in some ways to people like me. The first thing I read about was that it's actually there was a pagan ritual called Lupercalia, apparently, in Rome. And when we use the word pagan, it's a very loaded word for us Indians. And the reason it's extremely loaded is that we have learned these words through a Western liberal education and English language-based education. And the word pagan is loaded with animistic or primitive kind of ways of living and being. And that comes from the lens of Christianity. But our own culture, Indian culture, and Indian religions, all the ones that were active in India at the time, would also be classified as pagan and heathen. And so that's deeply troubling to people like me. Uh, Now, modern anthropology is uncovering that it's actually wrong to look down on these things as somehow animistic or primitive. They're actually beautiful and wonderful ways of human expression that were just presented to us through this lens of, basically Christian lens. And so that's somewhat problematic. So then the story goes that, I believe there was a Roman emperor, and he was pretty, he wanted to send everybody to war. And there was this saint or martyr, one of the there are like three different Valentines, and he was imprisoned. And so he used to somehow he used to encourage lovers to marry, and maybe they were encouraged to marry so that the guy didn't have to go to war or something like that. And so this is posed as a conflict between this extremely pious, gentle martyr, who's Saint Valentine, whereas history is written by the victors, right? We don't
Yeah.
have that balanced perspective, and so to elevate someone like that is somewhat problematic to me as an Indian, coming from a different background. And so that's why I said it's complicated. There's a lot to unpack there, right?
Yeah.
So you have this, in my opinion, a troubled background that I'm not sure I completely empathize with, and then you add on Hallmark and all the consumerism and the stuff. So I think, but then let me then try to understand it from your generation's perspective, whether or not you have all this. I'm very empathetic to the fact that there's a lot of peer pressure. Growing up in the US is not easy. I know from my little knowledge of my daughter's experience and what I've seen. School is a tough place. There's like popular kids and cool kids, and then there are the serious kids, right, and then who you
Sure. Yeah.
sit at lunch with, and being really good in sports and being very muscular is considered the thing for guys, right? There's only a subculture in which the things that maybe Indians are naturally good at are valued. And it's there's a lot of need to fit in. There's a need to be cool, and to also be engaged in that broader social cultural experience as an insider and not as an outsider. And I know what it means to be an outsider because I was brought up as an outsider when I was a kid. So I'm deeply sympathetic. I can feel that. And so I'm not expecting that all this heavy weight of thinking that I've done has to descend on the next generation by any means, but that's kind of how I see it. So I'm hoping that by at least bringing this perspective, you tell me how you feel, how you view Valentine's Day, and at the end of the day, maybe we can come to some sort of a better understanding, right? So what do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, are you sure you didn't go to school here? Because I think you captured the dynamics in a typical high school pretty well. I I'll pick up the thread a little bit around this idea of how your generation grew up and not seeing it, right? Like not really even hearing about Valentine's Day until you got here, as you said. I think that informed my upbringing
Right.
in the sense of I don't think my parents really had heard about it either until they came over here.
Right.
So romantic love was not discussed or really acknowledged all that much in my household growing up. And I think that's common with a lot of
Yeah.
Indian American households. Um, my parents had an arranged marriage, and they had a very practical view of love. And that informed kind of how, I guess, present Valentine's Day was. It felt a little bit, I guess I didn't fully get it. In the sense of what you were saying about the Hallmark piece of this. It was interesting to see such a focus on romantic love when it was so different from what I was interacting with at home, right? In terms of, my parents and others. So for me, growing up, Valentine's Day was more about love in general. We would exchange cards. My parents would give me greeting cards, and I would give them one, and it was just more of celebrating love for one another,
Right.
which was kind of beautiful in its own way.
Yeah.
Now that I kind of look back at it,
Yeah.
and so I think it's interesting to see how it all kind of runs into each other, in terms of tracing the lineage from, I think, how your experience, probably my parents' experience, to how it impacted my experience and maybe your daughter's experience.
Right.
I do think you hit on a good point around it is a confusing time of the year to as a kid growing up to try to interact with Valentine's Day. There's a lot of stuff like, are you dating someone at school? Are you going to ask someone to be your Valentine?
Right.
Why haven't you asked someone you like to be your Valentine? Right? Those are common questions in my friend group growing up every year, and I didn't know how to relate to that because my parents and I couldn't even talk about dating, or didn't, right? We didn't have the vocabulary or the common ground at that point to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I still find it kind of difficult to talk to my parents about, topics around dating or romantic love. I think that's actually a pretty common theme as well that I see amongst a lot of my friends.
Right.
So I think this is actually the first of maybe several discussions we'll have centered around this theme.
We may never get out of the dating vortex.
Yeah, exactly. There is a huge difference, right, and a huge gap in my generation seeing Valentine's Day from the beginning to, others like folks in your generation maybe not even having heard the word Valentine until coming to the States.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's really interesting. Yes. And look, I was going to say welcome to the club of people who can't talk to their parents about dating. But while I make light of it, it's also a serious thing, right? I mean, it does cause so much emotional distress. So it's good that you and I can laugh about it. But this is also very serious stuff for a lot of people. And I want to honor that. I want to respect that. So when I laugh, I hope nobody thinks that I'm laughing at them. I'm just laughing at the absurdity of the situation to some extent, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think I completely agree with you there. Right. If you and I were having this conversation 10 or 15 years ago, I would not have been laughing. I would have been closer to crying probably around this topic. It's really tough. Yeah. It can feel very lonely. That's how I felt, kind of growing up. I've had conversations with friends that have said much the same thing.
Right.
So if we do have any younger listeners out there who are feeling some of this tension with their parents, I hope you're not alone. Yeah. The laughter now, I think, comes with a little bit of perspective of, okay, we're in slightly different positions.
That's right.
And have slightly different relationships in being able to talk to our parents about these things.
Right.
Which maybe we can touch on here a bit.
Right.
I have a story for you.
Sure.
If you want to hear it.
Of course. Go for it. Go for it.
So, this is a story from Valentine's Day, back when I was a junior in high school. And I think this will highlight some of what we talked about already in terms of the gap. So, at this point, I was not talking to my parents about dating at all. It was just not something that came up. I think my parents kind of grew up with the thought of, look, focus on dating down the line later in your future, after you've secured your future. In high school, you want to focus on getting into a good college, right? Setting your career. So with that backdrop, in 11th grade, I wanted to date someone, and I wanted to talk to my parents about it, but I couldn't do it face to face. I knew if I started talking about it, I would just feel I wouldn't get to say what I wanted to say. Right. So I decided to write a letter to my dad explaining why I wanted to date. Yeah. I thought it would be the best way to get my message across clearly. Started writing a letter. It was very emotional. Right. And one of my good friends in high school helped me edit the letter, thankfully, because I was just writing very emotionally. Right. And finally got this letter. I handed it to my dad. He was on his way out on a business trip. Right. So I handed him this letter and I said, Dad, I'd like to talk to you about dating. Can you read this letter and we can talk about it when you get back? Right. And my dad said, yes, absolutely. And he went off on his trip. Yeah. He came back, and I didn't really hear from him. So I thought, okay, should I bring this up? Should I not? I decided to wait. A few days later, it's Valentine's Day. And he gives me a card. Oh. It's a short and sweet card. And it says, like, Dear Nikhil, I love you. Thank you for being my son. It's very sweet. The last line reads, stay focused on your goals. And that was really tough for me. Right. And to my dad, I think that was having the conversation. Right. He felt like that was his view. It was kind of stay focused on your goals. Don't date right now. Right. But to me, that was not having the conversation. And it felt like I was not able to express to him or have that dialogue with him. Right. So to your point about, going through a lot of emotional turmoil, I was definitely in that
Yeah.
moment,
Yeah.
in this situation, and so several months went by. I think my parents actually turned a little bit of a corner here
Mm-hmm.
because several months later, I worked up the courage to ask my parents if I could go to prom with
Ah.
someone,
Uh-huh.
and I was really nervous.
Right.
I didn't think they'd say yes, but they said yes.
Right.
They said, "Yeah, sure,
Right.
go to prom."
Right.
So I went to prom, my junior year, and the person I went with, she and we actually won prom royalty,
King and
which was a
queen.
huge surprise, like
King.
completely unexpected. It was prince and
Prince and
princess
prince.
for the junior year, so
Right.
it was a complete surprise,
Yeah.
like completely unexpected. Had a great time. I came home. My parents were asleep,
Right.
um, and so I went to them, just to tell them, "Hey, I'm home." And they kind of asked how it went. I said, "It's good.
Right.
We actually won prince and princess, prom prince and princess."
Right.
And they sat up in the bed and they were so excited. They were like, "Wait, really?" And so I had a little sash
Right.
that said prom prince. They got out of bed. They took
That's
photos
sweet.
of me
That's
with this sash, and we had a good time and a
that's
good
sweet. That's
conversation
sweet.
about it.
Yeah.
So I'd be curious to hear what you make of this, but to me, I will always remember that around Valentine's Day
Right.
and this broader idea of just how do we talk about some of these issues with one another.
Right. Right. No, this is. First of all, thanks so much for sharing that. I think that's so courageous, and I respect that. Um,
Thank you.
so, to kind of give this from a parent's perspective, right? I'm a parent too, and I think I understand the underlying feeling behind most parents is that they want the best for you. I mean, that's one thing that I would
Mm-hmm.
encourage, and I think this is true in like 99.99%, and I hope it's true. They really do want the best for you, even when they are saying something or not being able to say something. Um, Let me frame it in a very broad perspective. All of us as parents, most parents, we want the best for our children. And we think we've had some life experience. And we think we've learned some things from that life experience. And we believe that following those same rules or mores or guiding principles will help the next generation and help them be happy. They want every parent wants their child to be happy and successful, and really that's what we want. I think the
Mm-hmm.
mistake comes in that some of those guidelines or mores or principles don't transfer across generations, and there are
Mm.
a few some underlying principles and values do. They do. Some part of it does. And that's why, if you remember earlier when we talked about this, I said learning to sift what is enduring. The notion of love is enduring,
Mm.
right? But
Yeah.
how we go about it and how we express it does change from generation to generation. So I think if we can kind of look at it that way, right? I think there may be some benefit to that. I mean, to go back to what you said, um, question of marriage itself. You talked about this notion of it being practical, but I also think I also wonder how is it that my parents' generation and the grandparents' generation were so skittish to talk about anything like dating or, God forbid, sex, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Right.
no, this is like I'm pushing it to the other extreme, right? Okay, and
Yeah.
and and, and I think it's important. So here's what baffles me, and I have a theory about it, and you can tell me. I'm a theorist, right? By now, I think everyone
Of
knows I'm a
course.
theorist. Okay,
Yes.
so if you go long, long back in India, right? India is one of the cultures that's been so open about sex. We are the ones who have the Kama Sutra, for God's sake. Okay.
Mm.
This is literally a treatise on how to have sex. Okay. If you go to Khajuraho, you look at the sculpture there, there is erotic sculpture. There's erotic sculpture in a lot of temples, right? For God's sake, if you're Hindu, as I am, our very conception is creation came from the union of Shiva and Shakti. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It is this is a cosmic sex act. That's what has caused
Mm.
creation, right? And I'm not saying this crudely. It's a divine act, but it's intended to sort of both uplift the notion of sexuality, but also tell us that sexuality is sacred. right? So, what boggles my mind is with all this backdrop, how did in the last three, four generations we become so unwilling to talk about it? What happened, right? And I have a theory,
Mm-hmm.
and my theory is that there was some sort of a decline in being very moralistic in our own society, and the fact that we were colonized by the Victorian British, there was some ugly resonance between the two. Okay. And my theory is that's why it's got really suppressed, because all the sort of puritanical morality of the church through Victorian England got resonated somehow with us. And we have this product that we have, like, I was telling you the other day in Tamil, we'd say, right, டேய் காலேஜுக்கு போறடா காதல் அடிக்க போறியாடா, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is,
Right.
are you going to college to study, or are you going to make to like have affairs and sort of be a lover boy, right? And
Right.
to be fair, let's back up also. Why do my parents think that way, and why do I also, to some extent, I would like, I think we have to explore all parts of our being, but is there wisdom in what they're saying? And let's think about that for a moment. See, this is a little bit rooted in our notion of ashramas in our Hindu society, which is, there is a brahmacharya ashram, like 16 to 18 years, you're supposed to be studying, and then you go into grihastha ashram when you're married, you're a householder, and stuff like that, right? And there is a great value given to the idea that celibacy or controlling your sexual desire when you're a student is going to give you tremendous power. And I think there's some truth to that. Um, and so it is not without basis that we do that. And as a professor, I've advised students, right? I've seen students who are single, married, with kids, and there's a spectrum of difficulties. I mean, when they're single, they can be very frustrated, and if their sort of social life is not well constructed, that can cause a lot of trouble, right? I think we fail to
Mm-hmm.
recognize that. But if you're married and you have kids, then you have less time for your graduate study. And I know students who have still done that, but it's in the end, it's their discipline, it's their, and I think maybe we are a little stuck on one model, which is that somehow this model of the ascetic student,
Mm-hmm.
which can work. I'm not trying to say it doesn't, but maybe it's not one size fits all.
Yes,
Right,
I agree.
right.
Um, yes, I love how you weaved all of that together, right? From a perspective across several decades, if not centuries, to the here and now.
Right.
Um, to your theory, that's a really interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
On kind of the colonization effect,
Mm-hmm.
and it makes sense to me hearing it.
Right.
I probably want to think about it more, but I think there's some merit to that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this piece you're hitting on about the ascetic student,
Mm-hmm.
and are there multiple ways to kind of be a good student or achieve
Right.
success professionally is at the core, I think, of this generational debate.
Right.
Because when I think back to my dad in that story,
Mm-hmm.
and having talked to him a little bit about it since,
Right.
that's the viewpoint, right? The
Right.
viewpoint is, look, like you said,
Right.
he was looking out for me.
Right.
He wants me to succeed. He wants me to do well,
Right.
and his perspective uh, and others, right, is that you can't lose your focus.
Right.
Stay focused on your goals, right? Exactly what he said.
Right.
If you go down this path of dating, you will lose your focus,
Mm-hmm.
and you will not be able to achieve what you could have, or whatever. You'll go down maybe a wrong path.
Right.
And I think my argument to him, what I tried to tell him a little bit in that letter was, I think there's a different way here. Which is like, maybe you can date and be successful.
Yeah.
I think that.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe more people in my generation would say, I want to be well-rounded,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I can still do well in school and get into the college that I want to and the career that I want to while exploring
Mhm.
dating,
Mhm.
right? Or while exploring relationships. And it's just, what strikes me is that it's so different
Right.
from the parental view,
Right.
and that I don't know how you bridge it. Like, I don't know if it's a scale and you can find yourself somewhere in the middle,
Right.
as much as you can try to understand where the other side is coming from and start to make a little bit of peace with it. Um, in the sense of, I can now see my dad's view in a way that I couldn't back in 11th grade.
Right.
In a way when I don't agree with it
Right.
still.
Right.
I think it's,
Right.
I really don't agree with it, but I can see where it's coming from.
Right.
Can we actually move on that scale? Can
I think we
parents
can.
move on that scale? Can kids move on? Yeah.
I think we can. I think we can. But I mean, I think at one end of the scale, you could imagine a situation where active dialogue actually changes minds, right? And maybe that's a bit ideal. Maybe it's an aspirational ideal. And then there's the other part which you said, where you come to a happy peace with it. It's okay, and you're still able to thrive. And there's probably another end of the scale where it's very sad, and you sort of accept and just have to move on. And but I do think there's a spectrum, right? The point that I feel has caused this shift is, see, in my grandparents' generation, every marriage was arranged marriage. There was no concept of being married outside the arranged marriage in India, right? In my parents' generation, there were, I believe, two instances of a marriage that was not arranged, and they caused a giant upheavals in the family for different reasons. And so it was just starting to come in, right? And my generation went through the entire, at least I did, of standing on the cusp of, which way to go. We were literally, it seemed like bisected down the middle, right? Some of my friends and other people have had arranged marriages. I chose not to, and yet it was very much in play in our generation, right? So that gives you a certain confidence in the sense that I'm going to do my studies, and then someone's going to take care of this, right? But I think what our generation doesn't understand is that that's not how it's for you guys, right? If you're not going to have an arranged marriage, you better gain some relationship skills while you're growing up. Otherwise, you're going to be a complete disaster, right? It's how can we expect you, after you've done all your studies, to suddenly turn on a switch and become this skillful, I don't know, dating machine, or who can find your partner? No, it's got to be learned, right? Right. So the question is, do we trust our children enough that we have given them the right values, that they know how to conduct themselves in those situations? And I think that's at the core of it, right? And it's always going to feel like our children are going into some terrible danger zone, but I think it's parental anxiety, and we need to calm down and trust that our children have the skills, because they're going to have to use those skills at some point in their future. So as long as we can do that, and as long as we have instilled the values, and there's there's some luck and grace and providence involved in all this, but I think if we move forward with trust, then there's a possibility, right?
Right.
I completely agree with you. See, what is to stop someone from it's your principles. Do I have a sense of responsibility? Am I accountable for my actions? If you have these two values, I don't see any reason why you cannot date responsibly. Right? And they're important values, right? You got to be accountable.
very important.
You got to be responsible. You got to be accountable for your actions. Do you feel yourself? And as long as you have that, I think it can, and you did, and that's why it worked, right? What do you think?
Yeah. I think you're spot on. I think what's coming to my mind is you have to have some limits, or some, like you said, principles, right?
Right.
And I think this is maybe also a bit of the divide in a ways, because I don't think I was not advocating for, hey, let me indiscriminately date and do this often and just all the time in 11th grade, right? And let me just throw away the school stuff, right? It was, let me integrate this into my life. To your point, I saw it as hopefully a skill I could develop, not a binary choice about how I'm spending my time.
Right.
But I think to my parents, it felt like making a binary choice, not trying to develop a skill.
Right.
And I hope through conversations like these, we can maybe prepare my generation and the next generation for how do we have that discussion? How do we say, like you said, if you're not signing up for an arranged marriage,
Right.
you do want to build the skill
Right.
in some way, right, of dating or
Yeah.
getting some of these experiences. Um, and how do we create a way to do that so that you're not kind of wandering around and trying to figure it out later in life, having had not as much exposure,
Right.
which frankly is kind of where I was when I hit my 20s, was kind of, what is dating? How am
Right.
I supposed to go date? Like, how do people go do this? Some of my friends, my non-Indian friends, have been dating since high school, some
Right.
earlier. Um, you feel like there's some catch up, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
And um, I'm just thinking about the I guess I'm thinking about maybe the next generation that's coming up, the one
Mm-hmm.
that's growing up
Mm-hmm.
now, right? That
Yeah.
is in middle school and high school. And if you're out there and you're listening to this, we'd love to hear from you and your experience.
Right.
Um, I wonder if it'll be different for them,
Right.
and I just wonder how we speak about this in a way where this conversation does not become polarized, right? Between
That's a very good
um,
point. And I
the
do
two
want,
divides, yeah.
I'm really glad you brought that up because I don't mean to intend my opinion to be prescriptive in any way, by the way. I mean, every person is unique. Everyone has to make that decision for themselves with respect to, their family and their child and vice versa. Every child vis-a-vis the parent. But I think there are some broad themes that are coming out, right? So which I see when I talk to a
Mm-hmm.
lot of young people. So marriage itself is changing, right? So when you look at an arranged marriage, and you look at something in my parents' generation, marriage was kind of it was a closed contract for life, okay. And so even if you didn't know each other, you had kind of work it out. There was no getting out of it, right? But that's not what it is today. You know, there is a way out, and so when people now enter a marriage, they think of it as a companionate thing. They think of it as a soulmate.
Mm.
It's a wholly different viewpoint, right? And we can't deny that, right? So if somebody grows up through all of school with no clue about how to interact, and they go out and they think that their marriage is going to be like their parents' marriage, well, maybe in for a big shock, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I learned a
Yeah.
lot through my life experience about all that. I remember talking to my dad. This is an extreme case, going back and saying, "So, Dad, I really had this conversation." He said, "You never taught me how to
Uh-huh.
hang out with girls, right? Like how to interact."
Uh-huh.
And my dad told me and said, "Didn't you have cousins?" And I face palmed myself twice, like it's like so.
Yeah.
It's like how could you how does that count for anything, right? Okay.
Right.
But that's how we grew up too, and I'm not saying it's a good thing. I mean, in the sense, I mean, I respect my father. It's not like I mean, I can joke about it, but I can hold both within me. But
Yep.
I do think that
Right.
that was, I've been reading a couple of books which some of our readers might also be interested in, which I found very powerful. One is, and by the way, these books are not like blame your parents books, but
Mm-hmm.
they do help us understand. So one is called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. It's a
Okay.
powerful book. I mean, I
Mm.
again, like I said, don't think this is trying to blame anyone here. It's
Right.
trying to
Yeah.
understand. The other one is called Childhood Emotional Neglect, and I think the
Mm.
first one is this woman Lindsay Gibson, and the second one is Janice Webb. And I think, unfortunately, there is a lot of a lack of emotional intelligence in many traditional family structures, South Asian
Mm.
ones. I think it's just very very common, and that creates that kind of disconnect, right? Which is a complete lack of understanding of what the other person is talking about, right?
Mm.
So
Yeah.
anyway, I'm throwing that out there, but I think it has implications for whether we allow that experience and whether we allow it in a and there's an argument to be made for both sides. Now, for instance, we live in a very individualistic society here, right? And when
Mm-hmm.
you're young, you kind of think, why shouldn't I do what I want to do, right? There can be that thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I think my generation and traditional South Asian families are more structured by social mores. There's social pressure to behave in a certain way. There's good and bad with both. if you have too much social pressure, it becomes very constraining. But if it becomes too free for all and laissez faire, that's not good either. And I think
Mm-hmm.
younger people need to be aware of that. You know,
Yeah.
unlimited freedom is not going to be good for society as a whole either.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
Yes. Yeah. You are making me think, and maybe these are some takeaways I'm starting to come to in our conversation.
sure.
Um, Number one, our parents largely want what's best for us, right?
Yeah.
And they are doing their best. I think I wish I was able to have had that empathy and compassion. I think I largely did when I was back in that 11th grade situation, but I have more of it now, and some of that comes with age. So I'd encourage, if I could go back, I would have encouraged myself to think about that a little bit more, and to really put myself, say, in my dad's shoes there. Number two, I think there is something about the framing of the conversation, because I think as soon as I would say to my dad there, I want to date, right?
Right.
That immediately evokes a bit of this binary. Oh, he's looking to maybe date at the expense of his well-being and everything else.
Right.
A better way to have said it is, I want to figure out how to integrate dating into my life. Right? Something like that, which is, this is a piece of my life, but is just a piece. And of course it will interact and affect other parts of my life. But I'm trying to build a great life here. Right. And I think this is a part of it. Which maybe gets away from the binary choice of like, do you date or do you, I don't know, excel in school?
Right. And I think this date word itself is so loaded, right? So when I always ask my daughter, I always ask her, like, do you have friends of both, do you have, friends of both gender? And now, of course, we have to
Yeah.
think a little broader than that also. But,
Yeah.
in my sort of, uh, you may say conservative, traditional, fusty, like, okay, do you have boys and girls in your group? Like, are you friendly with both of them? Because to me, that's important. At least, even to me and my ex, we both valued friendship first. I think friendship is very important. And it's possible for a boy and a girl to be good friends without even anything beyond that entering the thing. And I think the ability to do that is very nice. And I think we should encourage that in our younger generation. Now, if it goes beyond that, great, right? But it's still always nice to have friends from the opposite sex, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you can always talk to them. And so I think, I mean, my sort of ideal utopia is where, both they just talk and they interact and they go out and do things together. And then if
Yeah.
something sparks, great,
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think that's very wise of you. I think that a lot of us maybe grew up feeling like we could not, or like could you actually be friends
Yeah.
with someone with a girl, right? And like, how might your parents feel about that? I think that is changing. That's probably shifted a bit
Right.
in the last 20 some odd years, right?
Right.
The other thing I was just reflecting on in our conversation, and I think one of the things I'm taking away, it's important to talk about this stuff. Reflecting back on my story, I had a friend who I could talk to about it and was helping me edit this letter, and
I know.
that processing was immensely helpful.
Yeah.
The processing we're doing here is immensely helpful for me today, right?
And for me as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and even back then I found I had a couple of other friends who I could speak to about this, and it made all the difference. In hindsight, maybe I wish I'd even pushed more to talk to my parents about it.
Right.
But I think I defaulted at some point to, you know what, let me just not speak about it
Right.
and just come to some type of resolution in my head about what I'm doing or not doing.
And we all do that, by the way. So don't feel bad.
Right. Right, yeah. But I want to maybe encourage myself and us here to think about being able to actively fight that. This podcast in some ways is a way to do that, right?
Yeah.
Because it's based on our conversation, but
Right.
it's helping me realize that is a conversation worth having in finding your friends and maybe if not, finding other allies for you.
Right. And I want to loop back to that one point, if you don't mind, that you made about how this holiday, it's about love. Love is a good thing, right? Throw away all the theory that I said all from the beginning. Love is a good thing, right? And the Greeks have a very nice distinction between what they call eros and agape. So, eros is like the more erotic love, and agape is sort of the larger love, right? So, what I liked about what you said is now in Valentine's Day, we may share, you can give a heart to anyone, right? It doesn't mean that you necessarily love them tremendously or you will get in their pants or something, but, it can span everything, right? I'm just being honest here, right? Right. And that's good. And I think that's a good thing about Valentine's Day. And I think we need to feel positive about that.
Yeah.
And I think expanding our vision that if somebody is seen with a girl, it's not like that's the only thing that's going on. And that's why I think the word dating makes me cringe a little bit sometimes, because I think it puts a lot of pressure on the relationship itself. It's like, why can't we just go get a coffee? Why does it have to be a date? But that's an American thing, and I don't think I'll ever be able to understand that. So,
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it definitely is a loaded word.
Right.
It comes with a lot of I guess preconceived notions, and everyone has their own view of what it is, right?
Right.
So if I say dating, you might have a certain thing in your head that is different from what's
that's
in my head.
and I think that's the key part of it. What do your parents think when you say I'm dating?
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
That's a very good.
Yeah.
Actually, that's something we learned, right? The first thing is we need to
Yeah.
unpack what the word means first.
The vocabulary,
Right,
yes.
right.
It's funny because you kind of want to define dating when you're talking to, say, another generation about this. But to your point, as soon as you say the word dating, it is hard. Some things pop into my head, right? And it might be hard for me to unsee that or to take in a fresh perspective.
Right.
So you almost have to define dating without using the term dating, and then have the conversation on some type of more neutral ground,
It might help.
which may be asking too much. Yeah,
Well,
maybe. Yeah.
But on the other hand, it might help. Or, maybe the conversation starts with like, what does so and so think about having a friend over? I don't know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and to be fair, actually, this also goes back to my story a bit. When I asked my parents to go to prom with this person,
Right.
they said yes. Like,
Right.
they thought it was a valuable social experience to have at that time, and they knew it was the big dance that year. And they said I had almost no confidence they would say yes. I
Right.
thought it was just going to be a no. So, I didn't use the term dating in that
Right.
context at all. I just said, "Can I go to this thing that's important to me?" And they said, "Yeah, you should go."
Right.
So you might be hitting on something that actually proved out in my story that I'm now realizing.
Well, I think also you were so beautifully honest. I mean, honestly, I think you have a fantastic relationship with your parents from what I'm seeing. I just wanted to say that. And I think it's a huge credit to both you and to them.
Yeah.
The story you shared speaks volumes about what wonderful people you both are. I think that's important to just say that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I do want to underscore this point here as we get toward the end of this conversation of, this is not to say one generation is right and one generation is wrong by any means. Or to say, parents haven't let us date for so long and my generation is now up in arms about it. I mean, there are elements of that here, definitely, but I think it is saying, what can we learn, right? What can my generation learn? What can your generation learn? And one thing I'm taking away is, like you said, we have to define the terms a little bit better, or maybe not use the term dating, but to more clearly say, hey, this is what I'm looking to do. This is what I want to do.
Right.
This is what I'm aiming for. This is the life I'm trying to build.
Right.
And to give some grace. We talked about courage and grace a little bit on the last episode, but to have some grace for the other generation's reaction.
That's wonderful. So, Nikhil, I think we hit upon some really good points today. And
yes.
I suspect this is a conversation that won't end in one evening.
I agree. I will tell you, I think you may have had the same experience of the folks that have started to listen to our podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is the most excitement for a topic like dating.
Okay.
Because it is such a, I guess, just a big topic, right? And one that generates a lot of feelings
Strong.
within our community, because we have a lot of different perspectives. So
strong feelings,
this is the start.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
this is the start of the discussion. not the end of one, but I'm glad we could tackle it at this time when Valentine's Day is coming up.
That's interesting because we didn't want to go here actually on our first episode. I just wanted to share that with our listeners. I wanted to do something benign on the holidays or something like that. But Nikhil, you landed us in the soup. It's entirely your fault.
I guess so, I mean, lean into it, right? When your listeners tell you we want to hear a little bit more about dating, you got to go where the wind takes you, right?
Oh, that is lovely. So that wraps up our discussion for today. We hope you enjoyed listening, and we'd love to hear back from you. You can also email us with comments, questions, or discussion topics you'd like to hear more about at chaiacrossgenerations@gmail.com.
We'll be back next time with another discussion around a cup of chai. If you like what you've heard, subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
As you know, we create our own music. This is our own version of Father and Son by Cat Stevens, now known as Yusuf Islam. I'm delighted to co-host this podcast with Nikhil, who is very talented, as you all know. But what you may not know is that he made rasam this past week that he says tasted good, but I'd like